Gandhi is identified so completely with the rural that any idea of linking him to the urban is seen at best as gimmicky or some kind of a sleight of hand. But so what I thought I would need to do first is to first make out a case as to why you need an alternative interpretation of the urban, and then get to the Gandhian method and or at least my interpretation of the Gandhian method, and see how that helps us understand the urban in a way that I believe is superior. It's a claim I'm making. It's superior to that is offered by most other later developments, and handles, I think, one of the major challenges that exists in urban studies literature, the whole conflict between the apparent theoretical conflict between those who look at space or the spatial dimension in particular, and those who look at the networks and the apparent mutual exclusivity that is there. So, to I'm sorry. My basic condition here is that the basic argument here is my sort of initiative comes from an understanding of Indian cities and the fact that we find it so difficult to explain. There are aspects, I mean, if you're teaching, I know, for instance, in the National Law School here, the initial starting point of a lecture used to be that you know, how do you explain law, how do you explain why people follow rules, and the usual starting point was a traffic light, until they realized they were speaking in Bangalore. And then you suddenly realize that none of it works. We ride our scooters on the pavement, we do a lot of things, we come the wrong side, and we do a lot of things that don't work. But it is a little more, this is normally treated as a largely Indian problem and problem of governance, etc. But there is a more critical element to it, and that is that there is reason to believe that as urbanization increases, there is an increasing tendency to get, if not illegal, to get quite contemptuous of legal processes. And I think, which is why I would start with a result that we got from a survey that we did recently in Bangalore. It's a fairly large survey, covering about 18,000 individuals finally. But essentially what we were trying to do was to look at various things. But what I found most fascinating, one of the many results we got in that survey, and what was most fascinating was the number of people who say they do not, house owners who say they do not pay property tax. Mind you, this is the house owners, and this is not any kind of thing of people saying, people who actually don't pay property tax. It is people who claim, who absolutely openly state they don't pay property tax. I can see that as high as 23.4% in Bangalore. Right? And now, of course, it is so substantial that rather than trying to regulate them, you're trying to change the law to make what they do acceptable. The whole akrama sakrama business that we're coming up with in Bangalore is an attempt to deal with this. But what is even more interesting from the conceptual point of view is that as we go down to the smaller cities, the acceptance is total. Right? Nobody, at least, I'm sure there are people in Shahabad who are also not paying their taxes, but they don't say so. Right? They don't think it is socially acceptable to say so. Right? But you can, it's almost a linear thing. The next largest city in Karnataka is Mysore, and you can see it's got the next largest percentage of people who say they don't pay tax. You go to Dharwad, Gulbarga, these are the big, other cities. And if you go to smaller towns, whether it's Mulki or Shahabad, you generally get a much greater acceptance. So there's something about our pattern of urbanization, something about our processes of urbanization that increases contempt for basic regulation, basic norms that work within it. Right? And question is that how does one live within that? And I think one of the reasons for that is much of our strategy for urbanization, or much of our policy making in urbanization, urban planning in general, functions as if the city is clearly defined. Right? It is largely borrowed from countries where urbanization was completed or fundamentally completed in the last century, or early in the last century, or sometimes very often before that. So you have very large, the actual urban population is quite fixed. There's no continuing change of that. Whereas in India, whatever we might say about the way we measure urban populations, the fact is around a third of our population at best can be categorized as urban. A majority is still non-urban. More than that, you are functioning in a process of urbanization where there is continuous change taking place. Second is that what has happened with you is that you confine your conception of cities to a territorial element. Even the JNN starts with the conception of city. There is no mention of urbanization as a process really within that, as to how what happens to rural, what are the linkages, that doesn't enter the picture. You start with a city as you would if you were looking at, say, the United States, where essentially the cities are clearly defined and the process of urbanization has long been completed or close to completed. So when you get these perceptions, you recognize at best that there are new areas coming up, but you're still functioning primarily on a territorial basis. Right? Essentially identifying territories, and you take change as confined to territories. So you get concepts of peri-urban, you get concepts of the desa quota, or whatever words you're using, but it's still largely a territorial perception. And the third aspect that is inbuilt into our perception of the urban or of urbanization is that it's a unidirectional movement, that people are moving from the rural to the urban, and it is a clearly demarcated thing that once people come from the rural to the urban, they don't go back, right? And this is a process. We look at migration that way. We are no longer talking of net migration, despite the fact that we have very well-known examples of the reverse. When the Mumbai textile strike took place, workers went back in droves back to their villages, right? So that process has happened before, and I'll give you evidence of it happening currently as well. So essentially what we are seeing is an element of unidirectional movement and an element of temporariness. This, if we look at a study that we did for garment workers in Bangalore, we found that essentially what was happening was that you would have the male worker coming to a city, finding a job, then getting his wife would get a job there, and they would even leave their children back in the village. Right? When that happens, there is a continuing link with the village. That changes the nature of urban functioning. There were women who had left their jobs just because they wanted to take the child back to the village or get the child from the village during the vacation. Right. So there are whole structures that are changing, the urban forms of functioning, the very nature of the system keeps changing, which introduces a sense of temporariness. People go back to the village, come here, they very often relate to the village, they very often pick up aspects of the village in their urban life. You could find many people coming to a city, going back, doing an NREGA job, coming back here, or whatever element that they are doing within it. And you can just see, this is just to get sense of what are the reasons why they move out, why you get this temporariness. And so we looked at the garment export industry in Bangalore, as I said, and 25% of the children of the women workers there actually were living away from the mother, right? And this, when you went to the 0 to 5 age group, was actually as high as 40%. Right? And most of them were back in the village where the mother came from, right? Or the father came from. So essentially, they were back in their traditional villages, traditional habitat. In that kind of a system where your children are back there, there's no way that your urban and rural lives are completely separated. There's a continuous interaction. There's a continuous process. And you can see this is just a test we did to see why they moved to the and you can see that the normal reasons that you would look at have no real connection, whether it's the education of the mother, the income of the mother, the roof type, or even the availability of water, because if there is, even in the village, their water is not available at home, so there's no real change in it. But once you move to the other elements, things change quite rapidly. The further the mother has to go to work, the more likely she is to leave her child back in the village. The availability of a toilet, which is a statement really on the security question within Bangalore, that availability of a toilet leads you to, if you have to go out for it in the night, you want to leave your child away back in the, and so on. You can just go on with this, but the point to take away is that we're really looking at a process of temporariness in our urban situation, on which we are putting very stable, permanent constructs to try and analyze it. Right. So what I think we can learn from in this is something that we can take from the literature on globalization, really. And I think Saskia Sassen's work on territory authority rights is a useful one. And particularly her way she defines a boundary is that one is that the boundary is that the border is embedded in the product, the person, and the instrument. A mobile agent endogenizes critical features of the border. The other is that there are multiple locations for the border, whether inside firms or in transnational domain. She's talking of globalization, but essentially in the in the urbanization context too, you can use the same idea that there are borders that are located within the city itself, right? Where you're talking about the border of the workplace, the border of the residential areas they come from, the border of the entertainment strategies that are open to them and what they can relate to, right? But what is more important, there is the mobile border, the border that's embedded in the product, embedded in the person and the instrument, right? Where the person who continuously interacts with the village takes back aspects of the urban into the village, and vice versa. Elements of the rural come into the city in a way that is much more widespread than is often recognized. That the rural is entering, I think, not just in terms of the areas or the new villages that are being absorbed into the city, but also in terms of basic practices, the kind of politics that takes place, the kind of identity that takes place, that is there. And that identity element is sort of strengthened by technology with the coming of television. In fact, in our survey, when we went to the houses of those women workers, in no household did we find a television channel on that was in a language other than the mother tongue of the worker. So they were really had a workplace which was global, with global labor standards. They returned home to a home that was as if it was in their village back in the day. So there was a complete sense of a mobile border, and this is having implications for a variety of things. For instance, in the latest Muzaffarnagar riots, people who have studied the riots like Ashutosh Vashni were surprised by the fact that you're finding large-scale riots in the rural areas. This is something that didn't typically happen. Most generally, communal riots were an urban phenomena. But as you find this kind of interlinkages, a sense of temporariness between the urban and the rural, urban practices and problems are being extended into the rural as well. Right? So the question then is, how do we conceptualize cities, and how is the current conceptualization of cities good enough or interesting enough to understand this process, right? And it's clear now, I think most literature over the last decade particularly, but perhaps even earlier, is quite clear that the early 20th century idea of a bounded city, of a clearly bounded city, is no longer very useful to understand cities. That cities extend beyond it, the influence extends beyond those boundaries, and they get influenced by factors beyond those boundaries, right? So this has led to the whole, with Castells to begin with, and then several others, including Latour and others. You're talking about essentially a shift in focus away from the bounded city to networks, right? But in this search for urban networks, particularly in the case of Castells, I think, there is a tendency to ignore the role of space. Right, we tend to make space a very limited aspect. There was talk of virtual cities, there was talk of the global village. Those elements may have receded into the background now, but that remains the idea of an urban network or gaining precedence over urban space is something that is catching on. At the other extreme, we have the whole idea of space still being relevant. No doubt space is no longer treated as just some inert geographical territorial concept, but is treated as a much more political space, as in Lefebvre, where the essential effect is to look at representational space and how that works, right? So, but in somewhere along the literature, you find an unstated assumption that the two are mutually exclusive, and to either function with the network analysis, or you function with the more space-dominated concepts of a city, right? And therefore, I think when we look at this, there are sufficient evidence of both urban networks. I think in a globalized world, nobody challenges that. At the same time, the spatial element doesn't quite disappear, right? Even in a global element like sport, like Sachin's final test has to be in Mumbai. There is a sense of space that doesn't finally go away, right? So the question then is it possible to develop a method of analyzing cities, of understanding cities, that is able to link the elements of space with those of the network? Is it possible to identify a method that looks at the local and links it to global networks? Right. And my contention, and what I'll try to argue today, is Gandhi provides such a method. Right. Now, I must make it clear at the outset, when I use the term Gandhi or Gandhian, I'm using it primarily as an intellectual property right kind of version of the. I do not know what Gandhi meant. I never met the man, and I don't. So it's very difficult to say what ideas he had or what he thought or what he did. These are all interpretative, which are interesting. But if you go through his 100 volumes, you will find enough to satisfy at least I think 5 fairly contradictory perceptions of the man. Right. So I think really that is not the issue that one is taking here. One is referring to it Gandhian, not in the sense that I believe he necessarily took the method that I did, but essentially that this method one has put together has been taken entirely from his collected works. So since every element that is there and has put together is from Gandhi's writing, I would argue that it is a Gandhian method. Whether it is the one that he meant, I don't know. Gandhi never wrote an intellectual piece in his life. His intellectual ideas were built into communications of other kinds, right? Whether largely political, but sometimes even personal. And he didn't. I mean, the feminists have not, may or may not fully accept him. They perhaps don't. He was arguably the first who made the point that the personal is political, and the other way around. So in a sense, what one is trying to do then is I've tried in an earlier work in 2001, published in 2001, to distill the Gandhian method from his writing, just to identify a method of analyzing society, on the argument that in the 20th century there was no other person who mobilized as many people as he did, not Mao, not Lenin, not any of the others in terms of sheer numbers. And if he was able to do it, he had to do it with an understanding of society. So in addition to looking at Gandhi, the person, we need to look at what was the method he used to understand society. So it was on the basis of that that one sort of worked on a method. And now what one is trying to do is whether we can use that method in an urban context. Now, to use Gandhi with the urban, as I said right at the outset, is normally seen as antithetical. It is Gandhi is seen as anti-urban. He believed India lived in its villages, and therefore how do I take an essentially village-based philosophy and convert it into something that will understand the urban? But if we look at Gandhi, and I believe there's reason to interpret him in a slightly different way, that he was looking not at the village but really at the local. And his argument was that since the bulk of the local in India was in villages, that has to be our starting point. Right? If we take that view, then what we are seeing, what we can argue is that the local exists not just in villages but in urban spaces as well. And when we look at then the term of the Gandhian method of local would include local urban spaces. More importantly, this focus on local urban spaces would increase at a time when everyone's talking of fragmented cities. Right? I don't think we need much evidence today to convince people that cities are deeply fragmented, particularly in Bangalore. The contrast between between the two sides of this road itself is quite stunning, particularly if you go a little further down and see Lower Palace Orchards and Upper Palace Orchards and go further to Waiali Kaval. You get completely very, very fragmented cities, different people living there, different cultures, different hopes, different aspirations, different cities in their totality. So what we really need to look at then is the local. And if we see Gandhi's method as a local method, then the main thrust of the Gandhian method is it links local space to global processes. This is a consistent theme in Gandhi right through. Though he's focusing on the local, he's consistently linking it to global processes. Thus, even when he takes a position like Swadeshi or burning foreign cloth, right, he finds it necessary when he gets a chance to go to England to defend his position with the mill workers, to try and convince them as to why he needed to do it and what he was doing. right? He always recognized the global links of every local position, that nothing local would be completely independent of what's happening globally, right? So using that element, we can then first try and understand broadly what the Gandhian method is, or at least what this interpretation of the Gandhian method is, and then see if we can see how we would use it to understand Indian cities or cities in general. The starting point for Gandhi, and this has various sources that we don't need to go into, including the Bhagavad Gita, is that essentially society is a series of interconnected actions, right? And it is not really a set of systems, but one of interconnected actions. In that sense, he goes back or links up to classical philosophy, both Indian, which is where he derives it from, but also it's perfectly consistent with, say, the sayings of Heraclitus, where you never step into the same river twice. Essentially, the continuing process, it's consistent also with Whitehead's process philosophy, where you look at the entire society as a series of processes rather than as systems. Right. So once you take it as a series of processes, then essentially society for Gandhi is a set of interconnected actions. Right. Now, in this interconnected actions, if you're going to act, there's no way you can wait for all the evidence to come in. You're very rarely functioning with perfect evidence. You're very rarely functioning with the idea that we know, or that if I don't know, I can wait until we know. Right. If we don't accept that we can wait until we know, and that we're always acting in it, anytime when you're driving a car, there are elements of judgment that come in. When you're doing anything further, there's elements of judgment that always come in. Once you do that, then Gandhi would argue, and he argues explicitly, that essentially in life we are dealing only with relative truth. We don't have an absolute truth to deal with. Right? Absolute truth, he went on to argue, was God, and that is something we could trace to the Advaita tradition, but that's a different issue altogether. But essentially, you are dealing only with relative truth at all points of time. So you have an element that you know, or that is widely known, or that is considered scientific, and then you have an element that is beyond science. Right? This is something that even the most positivist of philosophers of science would accept, like Karl Popper's distinction between science and non-science is similar to this, except that Popper would argue that what is non-science is in the realm of metaphysics. It does not enter what we say we should do. Right? It does not enter a scientific method. But because Gandhi is saying actions are what everything is about, you don't have the luxury of waiting till you have a scientific knowledge or scientific solution. Right? So you're always acting both on the basis of reason and on the basis of faith. What Gandhi would argue is that reason is more important than faith. That's the only constraint he put on it. That I couldn't say on the basis of faith that I'll do something that go against something that reason suggests. When there is a conflict, reason was always superior to faith. But he recognized that there were times when reason was not enough. There were parts of actions which reason alone would not explain. Right. Once you take the primacy of actions, he went on to argue that all actions should be evaluated by their consequences. Now, this takes him to a consequentialist position, where people would argue that there is a difficulty with that consequentialist position. After all, does it justify, for instance, Stalin's killing of 40 million or whatever number of Russians he did, right? And Gandhi's answer to that was that essentially you are dealing with a set of that everything in life is connected with everything else. So you cannot always break up the cause from the effect, or the means from the ends. What is the means in one case is the ends in another. Right? Killing of those Russians might have been a means for Stalin, but as far as those Russians were concerned, it was the end. Right? So really, there is no real distinction between the means and the ends, and therefore the goodness of the consequences implies the goodness of the means. Right? You cannot use adverse means in the hope of getting positive consequences. Right? And then he said that essentially once you decide on an action, or individuals decide on action, they negotiate over it, and that negotiation is based on three elements essentially. The first element is empowerment, right? The strength that you bring in, financial, economic, social, whatever you like. Then there are the options, and this is a critical part where Gandhi departed from the traditional Marxist thinking of the time. This was clearly seen in the trade union movement of the time. While the trade union movements of the Marxists focused on the workplace and mobilizing people within the workplace and strikes within the workplace, Gandhi's whole focus was on creating options for them, right? And he always argued that workers had options, their bargaining power increased, right? So it was a fundamentally different form of mobilization. He used khadi, for instance, as an alternative set of options for workers that would strengthen their bargaining power. This has not been taken too seriously in trade union literature, though you could argue that with the coming of the IT revolution, the power of options has been truly shown up, because nobody in the IT industry bargains on the basis of their workplace. They bargain by the ability to use an option and get another job. Right? And that has had a much greater impact on this. The third element of negotiations is a sense of fairness. Now, it is not that the sense of fairness is always appealing, but it is something that can be used either positively or negatively. You can say something is unfair. Less than poverty line wage is unfair. Right? So there's an element that comes in and has a role in these negotiations. Right? Now, Gandhi's analysis starts with the individual, and then it moves on to social groups as means of shared actions, right? When group people come together around a shared action. Since there are multiple actions for that an individual takes place, it requires association with multiple groups, right? So necessarily society will be plural, individuals will belong to more than one basic element, right? And for him then, institutions are really practices that are continuously repeated, right? So I can lay out in theory whatever I want, but if the practices are consistently of another kind, the institutions appear within that. For instance, there is a town in the border between, I think, Manipur and Bangladesh, or Meghalaya and Bangladesh, I forget, which technically, officially does not exist, because it is a place where the largest market of illegal arms. It's a well-established town. It has a proper urban structure. Illegal arms come in, they go. It is a place where anybody who wants illegal arms goes to, right? So you have a place that automatically becomes an institution, though there's no theoretical conception of that, no official sanction for that, right? It just becomes, right? So then the question comes is that how would one use this method to understand urban spaces, right? The first thing I would argue is that it looks at the individual identity within large urban spaces. So in a city, you find individuals functioning increasingly on an individual basis. At the same time, they are forming multiple groups. You are meeting today in this classroom. Tomorrow, each of you will, or evening, each of you might have different groups in which you go relax or go or recreation for recreation, or for any other point of view, for a political point of view or anything else. So essentially, you have individual identity within a larger social space, linked through the ability to form pluralistic groups, right? The second aspect is that individuals then are in a process of continuing negotiation, right? So you are negotiating within your social group, you are negotiating within on the street with the auto driver, you are negotiating elsewhere with whatever you want to do, right? So what we are functioning with essentially is a process of continuous negotiation. So the city really becomes a process of continuous negotiation, right? And at each point of time, those negotiations that are stable, that lead to consistent, repeated actions, become the institutions of the city, right? A child going to school is a part of a negotiation. It is one where the parents' empowerment probably increases overwhelms the right of the child. But whatever it is, over time you find that sets into regular practice, and then you get the school as an institution that emerges from that, right? So the whole process of urbanization then would be focused on what practices are taking place rather than the physical structures that are created, right? So if I create a JNN house, which is then rented out to somebody at with a much higher income, in practice, that whole policy should be seen as housing for the higher income or the middle income or whoever gets that house finally, right? Whereas in theory, it would be seen as housing for the poor, right? Okay. And then you find that if this negotiation is going to take place, you look at various ways in which you can form social groups to negotiate within that. And you can look for it through affinity to the neighborhood as a part of a larger negotiation. And it is that affinity that links the local to the global at each point within that. That I have an affinity to a neighborhood, but that neighborhood might be linked in some way to the global. If I make Electronic City, all right, and I have a campus within that, it is important that I have Colombian coffee available there because of the people who will be visiting that campus. So the local, or the way the local element is there within that, links up directly to the global, right? And then you get urban institutions basically as practice. Now, I'll just very quickly go, because I think we should discuss this, but essentially what are the arenas in which negotiation takes place in the urban? We said, all right, the individuals, they form social groups and they keep negotiating, but what are the broad arenas which they do? And I think if we use the Gandhian method, essentially what we're looking at is actions that relate to consequences. But actions themselves in Gandhi, and he borrows this from the Gita actually, have two elements within them, the urge to act and the act itself. The urge has three elements. One is knowledge. So the nature of knowledge in a society influence the kinds of actions that people want to take, right? So by controlling knowledge, you are in a sense controlling the nature of actions, right? This is something that Macaulay recognized very early when he said that the way to emphasize, to control or to empower colonial powers in India was to create a class which was Indian in blood and color, but British or English, I think is the word he used, in manner, culture, and thought. I mean, I'm not quoting him exactly, but basically that was the essence of his argument. And I think basically what the control over knowledge is an important part of action. This sometimes can be done, is seen in the ideological groups, but even in the non-ideological ones, what you tell your child, you see knowledge in a much larger sense, determines the nature of the social processes and the society you create. Second is that in that very large amount of knowledge, the actual knowledge that goes into an action is a particular set, and that choice is itself based on a number of elements that come into play. What particular element do I use when I'm defending a language, for instance? I choose a particular set of ideas. When I'm defending a free market, I choose one idea. When I'm defending the state, I choose another set of ideas. There's a choice of knowledge. So very often, though an argument is made as if it is a logical construct in which no other alternatives are possible, you will notice that very often we are talking of two very different things. The fact that increased competition increases increases efficiency is perfectly consistent with the need for state intervention where conditions for industry are particularly adverse or it's controlled. But in the way it is presented, it's often seen as contradictory and mutually exclusive, right? And the third, of course, is the role of the knower. And this comes from Gandhi's idea of, once I'm saying that I have an idea and science explains only a part of it, what I present then has to reflect both science and non-science. And whether I convince anybody depends on the person who's doing it. So the personality of the person who's doing it works extremely well, right? So in this method, for instance, in the 50s, you had to be a Mahal Nobis, very sensitive to the government, very sensitive to the role of the state, very sensitive to planning, to be taken seriously. By 1985, you had to be a Sam Pitroda, very sensitive to technology, very sensitive to global trends in order to be influential. Right? So you can see the change. The nature of knowledge also makes a difference. Based on that urge, once you begin to act, the means are of course critical. What are the specific means you use, right? Is it a winner takes all kind of an approach? Is it purely a commercial means? Are there any other elements that come into it? Right? Then there is the question of the process of implementation itself, the regulation and other elements that come into it, and finally the person who does it. So these are the elements that come in, and the city then is a continuous process of this interaction that's taking place at all points of time, right? So it is a set of processes, and in that sense, one could argue you never really step into the same city twice, right? But in all these negotiations, you're really looking at a much larger process of bias. When we say that we are dealing with it and knowledge is only partial or science is only partial, there is an element of judgment that comes in. And this is a concept that Gandhi develops, which he calls Swadeshi, but it's quite different from what Swadeshi is commonly interpreted as. In 1916, he was addressing a group of priests, Catholic priests, trying to build a case against conversion. And he argued that he brought up the concept in that larger argument, and he said that after much thinking I arrived at a definition of Swadeshi that perhaps best illustrates my meaning. Swadeshi is that spirit in us which restricts us to the use and service of our immediate surroundings to the exclusion of the more remote. And he was using this not just in a territorial sense, though that's the way Swadeshi is currently understood, but since he was talking to Catholic priests here, in this case he was really talking about the religious identity that he was talking about. So essentially he was talking about Swadeshi as a means, about a way we look at it from the immediate surroundings, right? But that's a preference in a larger connection. Right? And he went on to argue that unless you are completely comfortable with the immediate surroundings, you can't appreciate other positions. So for him, tolerance and knowledge of other religions, right, was built upon the idea of accepting or understanding your own religion. And this is an element of Gandhi which is, I don't want to get into a personal, but just a quick thing. Like for instance, he was able to emphasize the Advaita dimension of Hinduism, which was, though he was born in a different trend of Hinduism, he sort of took this element. And you will see that his acceptance of Tolstoy, for instance, is a shared set of values, that the God is within us is a part of the Advaita tradition. And you see Tolstoy, when Tolstoy says that, across from South Africa, he makes it a point to try and get in touch with him in Russia and build on that. So essentially what I've tried to do here is just give a broad outline, obviously, as to how it would work. Each of that can go into detail. I think I've already spoken for too long, so if we could probably stop here and see where it goes.